The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in courtroom 7B as Judge Patricia Whitmore shuffled through her papers, already irritated by the morning's packed docket. She barely glanced up when the bailiff escorted in an elderly man wearing a faded gray janitor's uniform, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes sharp and alert. What she saw was just another troublemaker disrupting her perfectly ordered courthouse. What she didn't see was the Purple Heart hidden beneath his work shirt, or the decades of distinguished service that had shaped the quiet dignity in his weathered face. In exactly 47 minutes, a single salute would change everything she thought she knew about respect, honor, and the man she was about to humiliate in front of a packed courtroom. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you. Make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in downtown Sacramento carried the usual mix of exhaust, fumes, and fresh coffee as 68-year-old Robert Bobby Chen pushed his custodial cart through the marble corridors of the federal courthouse. His rubber-soled shoes squeaked softly against the polished floors as he made his methodical rounds, emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces with the same attention to detail that had once guided him through minefields in Vietnam and peacekeeping missions in Somalia. Bobby had been working the early morning shift at the courthouse for 3 years now, arriving at 4 a.m. When the building was empty, except for security guards and the occasional insomniac lawyer burning the midnight oil, he preferred these quiet hours, when he could work without interruption and think about his late wife Margaret, who had passed 2 years ago from cancer. The job didn't pay much, but it kept him moving and gave him purpose. Most importantly, it helped him feel useful again after retirement from his civilian job as a machinist had left him feeling adrift. The other custodial staff respected Bobby. Though they didn't know much about his past, to them, he was simply the reliable older gentleman who never complained, always covered extra shifts when someone called in sick, and had an uncanny ability to fix anything that broke around the courthouse. What they didn't know was that Bobby had served 26 years in the Navy, rising through the ranks from a scared 19-year-old recruit to a decorated Master Chief Petty Officer who had led men through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. Judge Patricia Whitmore, however, saw none of this complexity when she looked at Bobby. To her, he was simply part of the courthouse furniture and visible labor that kept her domain clean and organized. At 52, Judge Whitmore had built her career on being tough, uncompromising, and maintaining absolute control over her courtroom. She had worked twice as hard as her male colleagues to earn her position on the federal bench, and she wasn't about to let anyone, especially someone she perceived as beneath her station, disrupt the authority she had fought so hard to establish. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, their worlds were about to collide in ways neither could have predicted. Bobby was cleaning the water fountain outside courtroom 7B when he heard raised voices coming from within. Through the slightly open door, he could see a young mother, Maria Rodriguez, standing at the defendant's table with tears streaming down her face. Her public defender, a harried-looking man in his 30s named James Patterson, was trying to explain something to Judge Whitmore, but she was having none of it. "Your Honor, my client is a single mother of 3 who was simply trying to keep her family fed," Patterson was saying, his voice strained with frustration. "The amount in question is minimal." "And she's already made partial restitution, Mr. Patterson," Judge Whitmore interrupted, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. "I don't care if she has 10 children. The law is the law. Your client committed food stamp fraud, and I will not tolerate criminals who think they can game the system because of their sob stories." Bobby paused in his cleaning, his military-trained hearing picking up every word. He had seen this scene play out countless times in the 3 years he'd worked here. Young mothers, elderly people on fixed incomes, veterans struggling with addiction or mental health issues, all parading through Judge Whitmore's courtroom where compassion seemed to be in short supply. Maria Rodriguez reminded him of his own daughter, Carmen, who lived across the country in North Carolina with his 2 grandchildren. Carmen was a nurse who worked double shifts to make ends meet, and Bobby knew how close to the edge so many families lived these days. His military pension and Social Security kept him comfortable enough, But he remembered the lean years when Carmen was growing up, when he and Margaret had to choose between buying groceries and paying the electric bill. "Please." "Your Honor," Maria was saying, her accented English thick with emotion, "I never meant to do wrong. My youngest son has asthma, and the medicine is so expensive. I just needed to feed my children." Judge Whitmore's expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew more severe. "Save your theatrics for someone who cares, Ms. Rodriguez. You committed a felony. The fact that you have children should have made you think twice before breaking the law. Let's not serve as an excuse afterward." Bobby found himself gripping his mop handle tighter. In all his years of service, he had never forgotten the oath he took to protect and defend not just the Constitution, but the principles it represented, including justice tempered with mercy. What he was witnessing felt like neither. The courtroom was packed with other defendants waiting for their cases to be heard, along with family members, lawyers, and court staff. Bobby could see the fear in their faces as they watched Judge Whitmore's harsh treatment of Maria Rodriguez. Knowing they might be next, "I'm sentencing you to 18 months in federal prison," Judge Whitmore announced, her gavel poised to make it official. "Perhaps that will teach you and others like you that there are consequences for your actions." "No," Maria cried out, falling to her knees. "Please, my children need me. They have no one else." It was at that moment that Bobby made a decision that would change everything. Setting down his mop, he quietly opened the courtroom door and stepped inside. His presence immediately drew attention, a janitor in his gray uniform standing in the back of the federal courtroom during proceedings was unusual enough to cause several heads to turn. "Excuse me?" Bobby said, his voice clear and respectful, but carrying an undertone of authority that came from decades of commanding respect in situations far more dangerous than this courtroom. "Your Honor, may I approach?" Judge Whitmore looked up from her papers, her face flushing with indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" "Bailiff, remove this man immediately." But Bobby didn't move. Instead, he stood straighter, his shoulders squaring in a way that suddenly made him seem less like a frail janitor and more like the military leader he had once been. "Your Honor, I respectfully request permission to speak on behalf of Ms. Rodriguez." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Whitmore's face turned red with fury. "You respectfully request? You're a janitor. You have no standing in this court, no legal training, and no business interrupting federal proceedings." "Bailiff Williams," I said, "remove this man." Bailiff Tom Williams, a former Marine himself, hesitated. Something about Bobby's bearing, the way he carried himself, struck him as familiar. It was the posture of a man who had earned the right to be heard. Though Williams couldn't put his finger on why he felt that way. "Your Honor," Bobby continued, his voice remaining calm despite the chaos around him, "I may be a janitor now, but I've spent enough time in this courthouse to know that justice is supposed to be about more than just punishment. This woman made a mistake, yes, but she's not a criminal in her heart. She's a mother trying to survive." Judge Whitmore stood up, her face now purple with rage. "How dare you lecture me about justice? You're just a janitor. You push a mop around and empty trash cans. You know nothing about the law, nothing about the complexities of judicial decisions, and nothing about maintaining order in society. Get out of my courtroom before I have you arrested for contempt." The words hung in the air like a slap. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something significant was happening, though they couldn't yet understand what. Bobby absorbed the insult without flinching, his expression remaining dignified despite the public humiliation. "You're right, Your Honor," he said quietly. "I am just a janitor now. But before I cleaned floors, I served this country for over 2 decades. I've seen real criminals, real evil, and real justice. And what I'm seeing here today isn't justice, it's just cruelty." The courtroom fell silent except for the soft sound of Maria Rodriguez sobbing at the defendant's table. Judge Whitmore raised her gavel, preparing to bring it down hard enough to restore order and assert her authority. Once and for all, that's when the courtroom doors opened, and Admiral Thomas Hartwell walked in. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus Thompson pushed his cleaning cart down. The marble corridors of the Federal District Courthouse in downtown Seattle. At 68, His weathered hands gripped the mop handle with the same steady precision they once held in. M16 rifle in the jungles of Vietnam. But those days seemed like a lifetime ago to everyone who passed him by without a second glance. Judge Patricia. Blackwood's courtroom was notorious among the courthouse staff, not just for the high-profile cases that passed through her domain, but for her razor-sharp tongue and complete intolerance for anything she deemed beneath her station. At 52, she had climbed the judicial ladder through a combination of brilliant legal mind and ruthless ambition, leaving a trail of humiliated attorneys and intimidated court personnel in her wake. Marcus had been cleaning her courtroom for 3 years, always arriving after hours when the building was nearly empty. He preferred solitude. It reminded him of night watch duty, when the world was quiet and a man could think. Tonight was different, though. A water pipe had burst in the basement earlier that day, forcing maintenance to work around the evening schedule. The judge had stayed late to review case files for tomorrow's docket, a high-stakes corporate lawsuit that would determine the fate of hundreds of jobs. As Marcus entered through the back entrance, wheeling his cart quietly across the polished floor, he couldn't help but notice the tension radiating from the bench where Judge Blackwood sat hunched over a mountain of legal documents. Her usually perfect blonde hair was slightly disheveled, and she'd loosened her judicial robes. Empty coffee cups and crumpled papers surrounded her workspace like battle debris. "Excuse me?" "Your Honor," Marcus said softly, pausing near the gallery. "I can come back later if you need more time." Judge Blackwood's head snapped up, her steel-gray eyes narrowing as they focused on the elderly janitor. She'd seen him countless times, but never really looked at him. He was just part of the courthouse furniture, as far as she was concerned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Just get on with it," she said curtly, waving a dismissive hand. "And try to keep the noise down. Some of us have important work to do." Marcus nodded respectfully and began his methodical cleaning routine. He'd learned long ago that silence was often the wisest course when dealing with authority figures who viewed service workers as invisible. He started with the jury box, carefully wiping down each chair and checking for any forgotten items from the day's proceedings. 20 minutes passed in relative quiet, broken only by the soft swish of Marcus's mop and the rustling of papers from the judge's bench. Then came the sound that would change everything, heavy footsteps echoing from the main corridor, followed by raised voices. "I don't care what security protocols say," a man's voice boomed. "That old fool cost me $50,000 worth of contracts, and I want him fired tonight." The courtroom doors burst open, and Richard Hawthorne III strode in like he owned the building. At 45, he was everything. His trust fund and Ivy League education had groomed him to beat all, posing and utterly convinced of his own superiority. His Italian suit probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months, and his perfectly styled hair gleamed. Under the courtroom lights behind him trailed 2 nervous-looking courthouse administrators and a security guard who kept glancing apologetically at Marcus. "Mr. Hawthorne," Judge Blackwood said, rising from her seat with obvious irritation, "this is highly irregular. My chambers would be the appropriate venue for—" "I don't have time for venues and protocols," Hawthorne interrupted, his face flushed with anger. "That janitor," he pointed accusingly at Marcus, who had stopped mopping and stood quietly beside his cart, "deliberately sabotaged my presentation this morning. He unplugged my laptop during the settlement conference, and now Meridian Industries is pulling out of the deal." Marcus felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He remembered the incident clearly. He'd been cleaning the conference room early that morning when one of the outlets started sparking dangerously. Following safety protocols he'd learned in the Navy, he'd immediately unplugged all equipment and reported the electrical hazard to maintenance. He'd tried to explain to the frantic businessman at the time, but Hawthorne had been too busy screaming at his assistants to listen. "Is this true?" Judge Blackwood asked, her voice dropping to that dangerously quiet tone that made seasoned attorneys nervous. "Your Honor," Marcus began carefully, "there was an electrical hazard in Conference Room B. The outlet was sparking and could have started a fire. I followed proper safety. I don't want to hear your excuses." Hawthorne exploded, taking a threatening step toward the elderly janitor. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Do you know what you've cost me? Marcus stood his ground, decades of military bearing keeping his spine straight despite the verbal assault. Sir, I was doing my job. Safety comes first in any facility management safety. Hawthorne laughed harshly. You're a janitor. Your job is to empty trash cans and mop floors, not make decisions about electrical systems. You're not qualified to determine what's safe or unsafe. Judge Blackwood watched the confrontation with growing interest, her sharp legal mind already forming opinions about the characters before her. She'd dealt with Richard Hawthorne before he was exactly the type of entitled businessman she'd grown to despise during her years in corporate law. But the janitor's quiet dignity in the face of such abuse struck her as oddly familiar, reminding her of her own grandfather who'd worked in the steel mills. Mr. Hawthorne, she said slowly, while I understand your frustration with lost business opportunities, this is neither the time nor place for, with all due respect. Your Honor, Hawthorne interrupted again, his arrogance reaching new heights. This is exactly the time and place. This man works in your courthouse. He's a reflection of the standards you maintain here. Look at him. He's probably never made a decision more important than which bathroom to clean first. The security guard winced at the insult, and one of the administrators actually took a step back. Even in a building where power dynamics played out daily, Hawthorne's casual cruelty was shocking. Marcus felt the familiar burn of injustice, the same feeling he'd experienced when protesters had spat on him at the airport after his second tour in Vietnam. When employers had passed him over because of his age, when people assumed his worth based on his uniform and paycheck rather than his character or experience. You're right about one thing. Sir, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone in the room pause. I do make important decisions every day, like whether to report safety hazards that could kill someone, or whether to stay silent and let people get hurt because speaking up might inconvenience someone with money. Hawthorne's face turned an even deeper shade of red. How dare you lecture me? You're nothing but a janitor. You push a mop around for minimum wage because that's all you're capable of. You're a failure who couldn't make anything of his life. And now you want to drag successful people down with your incompetence. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Marcus had heard variations of them before, but they still stung. Judge Blackwood found herself leaning forward. Something about the janitor's composure under fire, triggering her instincts as both a jurist and a human being. I've heard enough, she said sharply. Mr. Hawthorne, you're out of line. Whatever your business grievances, this is not no. Your Honor, Hawthorne continued his tirade, completely oblivious to the dangerous edge in her voice. You need to understand what kind of people you have working in your building. This man represents everything wrong with the service industry. He's uneducated, making excuses for his own inadequacy. He's exactly the kind of dead weight that's holding back American productivity. Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, and suddenly he wasn't in the courthouse anymore. He was back in the Mekong Delta, watching 18-year-old Tommy Rodriguez take shrapnel to save a village full of civilians who would never know his name. He was in the Persian Gulf, coordinating rescue operations while oil fires painted the sky black. He was in a dozen classified locations where ordinary people had done extraordinary things that would never make the evening news. When he opened his eyes, his voice was steady but carried an authority that made everyone in the room stand a little straighter. Mr. Hawthorne, he said, you're absolutely right about one thing. I am just a janitor. That's what I do now, and I do it with pride. But that's not all I am, and it's not all I've ever been. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Judge Blackwood found herself holding her breath. Sensing that something significant was about to unfold, every person in this building, from the newest intern to Your Honor herself, deserves to go home safe at the end of their shift. When I see sparks coming from an electrical outlet, I don't stop to consider the stock portfolios that might be affected. I think about the human lives that could be lost. Hawthorne opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus continued, his voice gaining strength. You want to know about decisions? I've made them. Life and death decisions that affected hundreds of people at a time. I've stood on bridges while they were being shelled, calculating whether to evacuate a hospital or defend a supply route. I've held dying 19-year-olds in my arms while deciding which wounded soldier to save first when there wasn't. Time to save them all. The silence in the courtroom was profound. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. But you're right, Marcus continued, his weathered hands gripping his mop handle like a flagstaff. I'm just a janitor now. I'm proud to be a janitor. Because even janitors can save lives when they pay attention and care enough to act. Judge Blackwood realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just a man defending his dignity, but a glimpse into the kind of character that had built the country she'd sworn to serve. Hawthorne, however, was too consumed with his own rage to recognize the moment. "Spare me the war stories, old man," he sneered. "Every janitor thinks he's a hero with some sob story about the good old days. The bottom line is, you've screwed up my deal. And now you're trying to justify it with fantasies about being important." That's when the courthouse doors opened again. Everything changed. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom swung open with a weight that seemed to shift the very atmosphere. Admiral Sarah Pemberton entered with the kind of presence that commanded attention without demanding it, every step measured, every movement purposeful. At 59. She carried herself with the bearing of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives across multiple theaters of war. Her dress whites were immaculate. Rows of ribbons and medals telling stories of service that most civilians could never imagine. The silver eagles on her shoulders caught the fluorescent light as she surveyed the scene before her, taking in the tableau with the tactical assessment skills that had made her one of the most respected naval commanders of her generation. Behind her followed Captain James Whitfield, her aide-de-camp, and 2 Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents who had been coordinating with the FBI on a joint task force operation. They had come to the courthouse to serve classified warrants related to a defense contractor fraud case. But the sounds of heated argument from Judge Blackwood's courtroom had drawn their attention. Admiral Pemberton's steel-blue eyes swept across the room, cataloging details with practiced efficiency. Judge Blackwood standing behind her bench with obvious tension. 2 nervous courthouse administrators flanking the doors. A security guard who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. A wealthy businessman in an expensive suit, his face red with anger, gesticulating wildly. And there, standing quietly beside a janitor's cart, was a man whose posture she recognized immediately, despite the 30 years that had passed since she'd last seen him. "Chief Petty Officer Thompson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the courtroom. The effect was instantaneous and electric. Marcus straightened to attention with muscle memory that decades couldn't erase, his weathered hands moving automatically to his sides. Judge Blackwood's eyebrows shot up in surprise, while Hawthorne's mouth fell open mid-sentence. Admiral Marcus replied, his voice steady, despite the flood of memories washing over him. "It's been a long time, ma'am. Indeed it has." Chief Admiral Pemberton moved forward with deliberate steps, her eyes never leaving Marcus's face. "Though I see you're still putting safety first, it's just like you did on the USS Constellation." The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Judge Blackwood sank slowly into her chair, her sharp legal mind racing to process this unexpected development. The courthouse administrators exchanged bewildered glances, while the security guard stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or retreat. Hawthorne, however, was not one to let confusion derail his momentum. "Excuse me," he blustered, stepping forward with his characteristic arrogance, "but I was in the middle of addressing a serious matter with this employee. Whatever military connections he claims to have are irrelevant too." Admiral Pemberton turned toward him with a look that had once silenced. Admiral Zen made seasoned combat veterans reconsider their career choices. "And you are?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart people very careful about their next words. "Richard Hawthorne." Ow. 3. "CEO of Hawthorne Maritime Solutions?" he replied, puffing out his chest. "I'm a major defense contractor with Pentagon connections, and I demand that this incompetent janitor be held accountable for sabotaging my business operations." The Admiral's expression didn't change, but Captain Whitfield took a small step forward, his hand moving instinctively toward the file folder he carried. "Judge, Blackwood noticed the movement and felt a chill run down her spines. Something about this man's name was triggering alarm bells in her memory. Chief Thompson, Admiral Pemberton said. Ignoring Hawthorne entirely, would you mind telling me what happened here tonight? Marcus cleared his throat, his years of military discipline keeping his report crisp and factual. Ma'am, this morning during routine facility maintenance, I discovered sparking electrical equipment in Conference Room B following standard safety protocols. I disconnected all electronic devices from the compromised circuit and immediately reported the hazard to building maintenance. Mr. Hawthorne was conducting a business meeting at the time and was displeased with the interruption. I see. The Admiral nodded slowly. And the electrical hazard? Maintenance confirmed a short circuit in the wall outlet that could have caused a fire, ma'am. The entire conference room was shut down for emergency repairs until this afternoon. Judge, Blackwood found herself leaning forward, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to form in her mind. She'd heard about the electrical incident through the courthouse grapevine, but hadn't connected it to the quiet janitor who cleaned her courtroom. Hawthorne, meanwhile, was growing increasingly agitated at being ignored. This is ridiculous, he exploded. I don't care what rank you held 20 years ago. This man cost me a $50,000 contract because he can't follow simple instructions to mind his own business. Admiral Pemberton finally gave Hawthorne her full attention, and he immediately wished she hadn't. Mr. Hawthorne, she said slowly, are you criticizing Chief Thompson for preventing a potential fire hazard that could have killed or injured the people in your meeting? I'm criticizing him for overstepping his authority. Hawthorne shot back. He's a janitor. He has no business making decisions about electrical systems or disrupting important business operations. The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. Admiral Pemberton exchanged a meaningful glance with Captain Whitfield, who opened his file folder and began scanning through documents. Admiral Judge Blackwood interjected carefully. Forgive my curiosity, but how do you know Mr. Thompson? Admiral Pemberton smiled for the first time since entering the room, not the diplomatic smile she used for Pentagon briefings, but something genuine and warm that transformed her entire face. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson served under my command during Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm, she said, her voice carrying a note of pride. He was the senior chief of our damage control division aboard the USS Constellation. In that capacity, he was responsible for the safety and survival of over 5,000 personnel during combat operations. Marcus felt his cheeks warm at the praise, but remained at attention. Judge Blackwood was now staring at him with completely new eyes. While the courthouse administrators looked like they wanted to disappear into the marble floor, during the Gulf War, the Admiral continued. Chief Thompson's quick thinking and decisive action saved the lives of 847 sailors when an Iraqi missile strike caused catastrophic flooding in the ship's lower decks. He coordinated emergency response teams, managed structural repairs under fire, and personally carried 17 wounded sailors to safety while the ship was listing 12 degrees to starboard. The courtroom was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a freight train. Hawthorne's face had gone from red to pale, but his arrogance was too deeply ingrained for him to grasp the magnitude of his error. It's all very interesting, he said dismissively. But ancient history doesn't change the fact that he screwed up my business deal. I don't care if he was a war hero 50 years ago today, he's just a janitor who doesn't know his place. Captain Whitfield looked up from his files, his expression grave. Admiral, he said quietly, Richard Hawthorne III, CEO of Hawthorne Maritime Solutions. Yes, Captain. He's on our list. The words hung in the air like a sword of Damocles. Admiral Pemberton's expression shifted from warmth to cold professionalism in an instant. Judge Blackwood felt her prosecutor instincts kick into high gear. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone's world came crashing down. What list? Hawthorne demanded, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. What are you talking about? Admiral Pemberton walked slowly toward him, her metals catching the light with each step. Chief Thompson, she said without taking her eyes off Hawthorne. You mentioned that Mr. Hawthorne was unhappy about losing a contract. Which contract was that? Marcus glanced uncertainly between the Admiral and Judge Blackwood. "Ma'am, I believe he mentioned something about Meridian Industries withdrawing from a deal." "Meridian Industries," Captain Whitfield confirmed, flipping through more papers. "Defense contractors specializing in naval communications systems. Currently under federal investigation for selling classified technology to foreign entities." The color drained completely from Hawthorne's face. Judge Blackwood sat up straighter, her judicial instincts now in full alarm mode. The courthouse administrators were backing toward the door, sensing that they were about to witness something far beyond their security clearance level. "I think," Admiral Pemberton said softly, her voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that had once made enemy commanders surrender without firing a shot. "We need to have a different kind of conversation. Mr. Hawthorne." Hawthorne looked around the room like a trapped animal, finally beginning to understand that he had walked into something far more dangerous than a simple personnel complaint. His expensive suit suddenly felt like a target painted on his back, and his earlier bravado evaporated like morning mist. "I want a lawyer," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That," said Judge Blackwood, finally finding her voice, "would be an excellent idea." The Admiral nodded to the NCIS agents, who stepped forward with the practiced efficiency of people who had made thousands of arrests. As they approached Hawthorne, Admiral Pemberton turned back to Marcus, her expression softening once again. "Chief," she said, "it appears that your attention to safety protocols may have disrupted more than just a business meeting. It may have prevented classified defense technology from falling into the wrong hands." Marcus remained at attention, but Judge Blackwood could see the mix of pride and amazement in his weathered features. After years of being invisible, dismissed, and disrespected, the old sailor was finally being recognized for who he truly was. But the night was far from over, and the most powerful moment was yet to come. The NCIS agents moved with practiced precision, flanking Hawthorne as Captain Whitfield began reading from a prepared warrant. The businessman's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of panic that comes when someone realizes their carefully constructed world is about to collapse. "Richard Hawthorne III," Captain Whitfield announced formally. "By order of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and Naval Criminal Investigative Service, you are under arrest for violations of the Espionage Act, specifically the unauthorized transfer of classified naval communications technology to foreign agents." Judge Blackwood watched the proceedings with the fascination of someone witnessing legal drama unfold in real time. As a federal judge, she'd presided over countless criminal cases, but rarely had she seen someone's fate change so dramatically in the span of minutes. The entitled businessman who had strutted into her courtroom an hour earlier was now being fitted with handcuffs by federal agents. "This is insane," Hawthorne protested, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't arrest me based on some janitor's conspiracy theories. I'm a legitimate businessman with Pentagon contracts." Admiral Pemberton stepped closer, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Mr. Hawthorne, we've been investigating your company for 8 months. Your legitimate business has been selling encrypted naval communication systems to shell companies with direct ties to Chinese military intelligence. The only reason you're not already in federal custody is that we needed more evidence to identify your full network of conspirators." The courthouse administrators had pressed themselves against the far wall, their eyes wide with shock. The security guard stood frozen, clearly out of his depth in a situation involving federal agents and national security charges. Marcus remained at attention, his military bearing unchanged despite the chaos swirling around him. But Judge Blackwood could see the wheels turning behind his weathered eyes. Decades of service had taught him to read situations and people, and he was beginning to understand the full scope of what he had stumbled into. "Chief Thompson," Admiral Pemberton continued, turning back to Marcus, "when you disrupted Mr. Hawthorne's meeting this morning, you prevented him from finalizing a deal to sell classified radar specifications to Meridian Industries. Our intelligence suggests that those specifications were destined for Beijing within 48 hours. The magnitude of the statement hit the room like a physical force. Judge Blackwood felt her breath catch. This wasn't just about a disrupted business meeting anymore. This was about national security, espionage, and potentially preventing classified military technology from reaching America's adversaries. Marcus processed the information with the calm efficiency that had served him during 3 decades of naval service. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I was just following safety protocols. The electrical hazard was real maintenance, confirmed the short circuit." "I know that, Chief," the Admiral replied, and there was something in her voice that made everyone in the room pay closer attention. "But you need to understand something else. The electrical problem wasn't an accident. The silence that followed was profound." Even Hawthorne stopped struggling against his restraints, his face going pale as the implications sank in. Captain Whitfield consulted his files again. "Our technical analysis of the conference room indicates that the electrical short was caused by a surveillance device that had been illegally installed in the wall outlet. The device overheated when it attempted to transmit large data files specifically." The classified documents that Mr. Hawthorne was preparing to hand over during his meeting, Judge Blackwood leaned forward, her legal mind racing through the implications. "You're saying that Marcus Mr. Thompson didn't just prevent a business deal? He prevented an act of espionage by reporting a malfunction caused by spy equipment." "That's exactly what I'm saying, Your Honor," Admiral Pemberton confirmed. Chief Thompson's adherence to basic safety protocols exposed a sophisticated intelligence operation that had been months in the making. The irony was staggering. Hawthorne had spent the evening berating Marcus for being just a janitor who didn't know his place, when in reality, the old veteran's simple commitment to doing his job properly had potentially saved national security secrets from falling into enemy hands. Marcus remained silent, but Judge Blackwood could see the mix of emotions playing across his weathered features: pride at being recognized for his service, amazement at the unexpected turn of events, perhaps a touch of satisfaction at seeing his tormentor brought low. Hawthorne, meanwhile, seemed to be having a complete breakdown. The weight of his situation was finally sinking in, and the entitled businessman was transforming before their eyes into a desperate criminal facing life in prison. "You don't understand?" he pleaded, his voice rising to near hysteria. "I needed that money. My company is hemorrhaging cash because of defense budget cuts. I was just trying to save American jobs." "By selling American military secrets to foreign powers?" Admiral Pemberton replied coldly. "Mr. Hawthorne, you weren't saving jobs. You were committing treason." The NCIS agents began leading Hawthorne toward the courtroom doors. But the Admiral held up a hand, stopping them. She turned to face Marcus fully, and something in her expression changed, the professional mask slipping away to reveal deep, personal respect and affection. "Chief Petty Officer Thompson," she said, her voice carrying across the courtroom with crystal clarity 32 years ago. "You saved my life during the missile attack on the USS Constellation. I was a young lieutenant commander then, trapped below decks when the flooding started. You personally carried me to safety while the ship was taking on water and enemy fire." Marcus's composure finally cracked slightly, his eyes misting as the memories came flooding back. Judge Blackwood watched, transfixed, as she witnessed a moment of profound human connection that transcended rank and time. "Ma'am," Marcus said softly, "I was just doing my job. Any sailor would have done the same." "No, Chief," the Admiral replied firmly. "Any sailor would have followed orders. You went far beyond that. You made 17 separate trips into flooded compartments to evacuate wounded personnel. You coordinated damage control efforts while under fire. You probably saved the entire ship from sinking." She paused, looking around the courtroom at the assembled witnesses, Judge Blackwood sitting transfixed behind her bench. The courthouse administrators pressed against the walls, the security guard standing at attention despite his civilian status, and even Hawthorne had stopped struggling to listen. And tonight, Admiral Pemberton continued. 32 years later, you're still putting safety first. Still protecting people, still serving your country. Even if your country doesn't always recognize the service, what happened next would be talked about in courthouse corridors for years to come. Admiral Sarah Pemberton, one of the most decorated officers in the United States Navy, raised her right hand to her brow in a crisp, perfect military salute. "Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson," she said, her voice ringing with authority and respect. "It has been my honor to serve alongside you. Thank you for your service to our nation, both past and present." The effect was electric. Captain Whitfield immediately snapped to attention and rendered his own salute. The NCIS agents, both former military, followed suit. Even the security guard, a former Army sergeant, found himself saluting the elderly janitor. Marcus stood frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the recognition he had never expected to receive. Then muscle memory and 3 decades of naval discipline took over. He straightened to his full height, his weathered hand moving to his brow in a salute that was every bit as crisp and precise as the day he'd first learned it in boot camp. Judge Blackwood felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she witnessed something she knew she would never forget, a moment of pure respect and recognition that transcended all the petty hierarchies and social divisions that usually governed human interactions. For 30 seconds, the federal courthouse was transformed into something sacred. It was no longer about judicial authority or corporate power or social status. It was about honor, service, and the recognition that true worth isn't measured by job titles or bank accounts, but by character and commitment to something larger than oneself. When the salutes finally dropped, the spell was broken, but the impact lingered. Hawthorne was led away in handcuffs, his earlier contempt replaced by the shocked silence of someone who finally understood how badly he had misjudged the situation. As the NCIS agents and Captain Whitfield departed with their prisoner, Admiral Pemberton lingered in the courtroom. She approached Marcus, who was still standing beside his janitor's cart, though he somehow seemed taller than before. "Chief," she said quietly, "I know you found purpose in your current work, and I respect that. But if you ever want to come out of retirement, the Navy could use people like you in our security training programs. People who understand that real security starts with paying attention to details and putting safety first." Marcus smiled the first genuine smile Judge Blackwood had seen from him all evening. "Thank you, ma'am. That means more than you know. But I think I'll stick with my mop for now. Turns out there's still important work to be done, even for janitors." Admiral Pemberton nodded, understanding completely. She shook Marcus's hand with genuine warmth, then headed for the door, but she paused at the threshold and looked back. "Chief Thompson," she said, "don't ever let anyone tell you that you're just anything. You're a guardian. You always have been." And with that, she was gone, leaving behind a courtroom forever changed by the collision of assumptions and reality, of prejudice and truth, of dismissal and recognition. The courthouse felt different in the aftermath of Admiral Pemberton's departure. The marble corridors that had witnessed decades of legal proceedings seemed to echo with the weight of what had just transpired. Judge Blackwood remained seated behind her bench, still processing the extraordinary events that had unfolded in her courtroom, while Marcus Thompson quietly resumed his cleaning duties, as if nothing had changed, but everything had changed. The courthouse administrators had finally found their voices, whispering urgently among themselves about security protocols and media management. The arrest of a major defense contractor on espionage charges would inevitably attract national attention, and they were already dreading the phone calls from reporters and federal oversight committees that would surely follow. Marcus moved methodically through his routine, but Judge Blackwood noticed subtle differences in his bearing. His shoulders seemed straighter, his movements more confident. The weight of decades of being overlooked and undervalued had lifted, replaced by the quiet dignity of someone whose true worth had finally been recognized. "Mr. Thompson."
Out.
Judge Blackwood called softly as he worked near the jury box. "Could you spare a moment?" Marcus paused in his cleaning and approached the bench respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." For the first time in her judicial career, Patricia Blackwood found herself at a loss for words. How do you apologize to someone for years of casual dismissal? How do you acknowledge that you've been blind to the character and worth of a person who passes through your world every day? "I owe you an apology," she said finally, her voice carrying a humility that would have shocked the attorneys who knew her reputation for ironclad judicial authority. "I've seen you cleaning this courtroom for 3 years and I never really saw you. I never bothered to learn your name or your story. I treated you like part of the furniture. Marcus's weathered face showed understanding rather than judgment. Your Honor, you had no reason to think I was anyone special. I'm proud to do my job well. That's enough for me. But it shouldn't be enough for the rest of us. Judge Blackwood replied firmly. Tonight I watched a man who has dedicated his life to service first to his country. Now to this community, get attacked and humiliated by someone who assumed that his job title defined his worth. And I sat here and nearly let it happen because I made the same assumptions. She stood up from her chair and walked around the bench. Approaching Marcus on equal ground rather than from the elevated position of judicial authority, it was a gesture that spoke volumes about how the evening had changed her. Perspective. Tell me about the electrical hazard this morning, she said. Not the official report. Tell me what you saw, what you thought. What you decided. Marcus considered the question carefully. His military training evident in the way he organized his thoughts before speaking. Your Honor, I arrived at the courthouse at 5:30 a.m. to begin my pre-opening cleaning routine. Conference room B was scheduled for an 8 o'clock meeting, so I wanted to make sure everything was spotless. When I plugged in my vacuum cleaner, I noticed sparks coming from the wall outlet. He paused, his eyes distant as he recalled the morning's events. In the Navy, we learned that electrical problems on ships can kill people fast. Fire at sea is one of the worst nightmares a sailor can face. So when I see sparks, I don't hesitate, shut everything down immediately, even knowing it might disrupt important meetings. Especially then, ma'am. The more important the meeting, the more people who might be at risk. I unplugged everything in the room, tagged the outlet as hazardous, and called maintenance immediately. Then I went to find the people who were supposed to use the room to warn them about the safety issue. Judge Blackwood nodded.
Understanding now.
Why Admiral Pemberton had spoken so highly of Marcus's character. And that's when you encountered Mr. Hawthorne. Yes, ma'am. He was arriving early with his associates, carrying laptops and presentation materials. When I explained about the electrical hazard and suggested they use conference room A instead, double quotes, Marcus paused diplomatically. What? He made it clear that he thought I was overreacting and overstepping my authority. He said janitors should stick to emptying trash cans and leave important decisions to important people. The memory still stung, Judge Blackwood could see. But there was no bitterness in Marcus's voice, just resignation born of long experience with such treatment. I offered to help move their equipment to the safe room, Marcus continued. But Mr. Hawthorne ordered me to leave and mind my own business. His exact words were, I don't take orders from the help. Judge Blackwood felt a flash of anger at the casual cruelty of the dismissal. But Marcus seemed to take it in stride. I left them alone. But I positioned myself in the hallway where I could watch for signs of fire or electrical problems. About 20 minutes later, there was a loud pop from inside the room, followed by shouting. When I looked in, the outlet was smoking and Mr. Hawthorne's laptop had shut down completely, and that's when the meeting fell apart. Yes, ma'am. Maintenance arrived and confirmed that the outlet had completely failed. They had to shut down power to that entire section of the building for emergency repairs. Mr. Hawthorne's business associates left shortly after, saying they needed time to reconsider their partnership. Judge Blackwood shook her head in amazement. The morning's events had been even more dramatic than she'd realized. Marcus's quick thinking had likely prevented a fire that could have spread through the century-old courthouse, potentially killing or injuring dozens of people. Mr. Thompson, she said seriously, do you understand what you've prevented today? Not just the espionage, the fire danger alone could have been catastrophic. Marcus nodded slowly. I've seen what electricity can do when it goes wrong, Your Honor. In the Gulf, we lost 2 good sailors to an electrical fire that started in a supposedly safe compartment. If I can prevent something like that from happening again, even in a small way, then I've done my job. The simple statement carried such weight that Judge Blackwood found herself fighting back tears again. Here was a man who had spent his life protecting others, who continued to protect others decades after his official service had ended, and who did it all without expectation of recognition or reward. There's something else I need to tell you, she said, her voice taking on the formal tone she used for important judicial pronouncements. What happened here tonight is going to become public knowledge. The arrest of Richard Hawthorne will be front-page news, and your role in exposing his espionage operation will inevitably come to light. Marcus looked concerned rather than... Your Honor, I'd prefer to avoid publicity. I just want to do my job and go home to my family. I understand that, and I'll do everything I can to protect your privacy. But you need to know that there will likely be consequences, good ones. The FBI will want to interview you as a key witness. The Navy will probably want to recognize your service more formally. And this courthouse... Choosing her words carefully. This courthouse owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid. You've been working here for 3 years, and none of us bothered to learn that we had a decorated war hero emptying our trash cans. That's going to change, starting now. Before Marcus could respond, the courthouse doors opened again, and Chief Administrative Officer Daniel Morrison entered with several other officials. Morrison was a thin, nervous man in his 50s, who had spent his entire career navigating federal bureaucracy, and he looked deeply uncomfortable with the evening's unprecedented events. Your Honor, Morrison said, approaching the bench with obvious anxiety, I've been in contact with the FBI and Naval Intelligence about tonight's incident. They've requested that we preserve the conference room as a crime scene and provide complete maintenance records for the past 6 months. Judge Blackwood nodded. Of course, Mr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet Chief Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, whose actions this morning likely saved this building from both fire damage and a major security breach. Morrison's eyebrows shot up as he looked at Marcus with new understanding. Mr. Thompson, I had no idea. The federal agents spoke very highly of your service record. They indicated that your quick thinking may have prevented classified military technology from reaching foreign agents. I was just following safety protocols. Sir Marcus replied with characteristic modesty. Nevertheless, Morrison continued, pulling out a folder, I have some paperwork that requires immediate attention. Mr. Thompson, effective immediately, you're being promoted to Chief of Facilities Security for this courthouse. The position comes with a substantial salary increase and expanded responsibilities for coordinating with federal law enforcement on security matters. Marcus looked stunned. Sir, I appreciate the offer, but I'm not sure I'm qualified for Chief Thompson, Judge Blackwood interrupted gently. With respect, tonight proved that you're more qualified than any of us realized. You've been protecting this building and everyone in it for 3 years. Now we're just making it official. Morrison nodded enthusiastically. The position includes oversight of all maintenance personnel, coordination with federal security agencies, and development of enhanced safety protocols. Your military background and demonstrated commitment to protecting this facility make you the ideal candidate. As Marcus processed this unexpected turn of events, Judge Blackwood noticed something else in Morrison's folder. What else do you have there, Mr. Morrison? Ah, yes, Morrison said, pulling out an official-looking document. This is a commendation letter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, recognizing Mr. Thompson's exceptional vigilance and commitment to public safety in preventing what they're calling a significant breach of national security. It will become part of his permanent personnel file. But Morrison wasn't finished. There's also this, he said, producing another document. A personal letter from Admiral Pemberton. It's recommending Mr. Thompson for the Department of Defense Medal for exceptional civilian service. It's one of the highest honors that can be bestowed on a civilian employee. Marcus stood in stunned silence as the recognition continued to pile up around him. After decades of being invisible, dismissed, and undervalued, he was suddenly being celebrated as a hero. Judge Blackwood could see the mix of pride and overwhelm in his weathered features. "Sir Marcus," said finally, "I don't need medals or commendations. I just want to keep doing my job and keep people safe, and that's exactly why you deserve all of this and more." Judge Blackwood replied firmly, "Mr. Thompson, you've spent your entire adult life serving others, first in the Navy, now here in civilian life. Tonight, the world finally got a glimpse of who you really are." Morrison checked his watch and looked concerned. "Mr. Thompson, there's one more thing. The media has gotten wind of tonight's arrest, and they're asking questions about the courthouse employee who helped expose the espionage ring. I can have security escort you out through the back entrance if you'd prefer to avoid reporters." Marcus considered this for a moment, then shook his head. "No, sir. I've got nothing to hide. If people want to ask questions about doing your job and following safety protocols, I'm happy to answer them." Judge Blackwood smiled at his response. Even faced with unwanted publicity, Marcus was thinking about the opportunity to promote workplace safety and professional responsibility, rather than personal glory. "In that case," Morrison said, "I'll arrange for a proper press conference tomorrow morning. The FBI wants to make a statement about the espionage case, and they've requested that you be available to discuss your role in exposing the security breach." As the evening wound down and the various officials departed to handle the administrative aftermath of Hawthorne's arrest, Judge Blackwood found herself alone with Marcus once again. He had returned to his cleaning routine, but she could see that everything had changed in the way he carried himself. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "before you finish up tonight, I have one more thing to tell you." Marcus paused and gave her his full attention. 3 years ago, when you started working here, I made a decision to treat you as invisible. I convinced myself that acknowledging the service staff was somehow beneath my dignity as a federal judge. Tonight I learned that the person I was ignoring has more honor, courage, and integrity than most of the attorneys who appear in my courtroom. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "From now on, this courtroom will be different. Everyone who works here, from the newest intern to the most senior judge, will be treated with the respect they deserve as human beings. Your example has reminded me what real service looks like." Marcus nodded gratefully, but Judge Blackwood could see that he was still processing everything that had happened. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think Mr. Hawthorne really believed what he said about me? That I was just a failure who couldn't make anything of his life?" Judge Blackwood considered the question seriously. "I think Richard Hawthorne believed that a person's worth could be measured by their job title and bank account. He looked at you and saw only a janitor's uniform, not the man wearing it. He made the mistake of confusing what you do with who you are." She walked over to where Marcus stood beside his cleaning cart, the same cart that had been invisible to her for 3 years. "The truth is, Mr. Thompson, you're one of the most successful people I've ever met. You've served your country with distinction, raised a family, and continued to contribute to your community well into your retirement years. You've maintained your integrity and work ethic despite facing prejudice and dismissal from people who should have known better. That's not failure, that's triumph." Marcus's eyes misted slightly at her words. "Thank you, Your Honor. That means more to me than any medal or promotion," as the clock on the courthouse wall struck midnight. Marcus finished his cleaning routine and prepared to head home. Tomorrow would bring reporters, interviews, and a level of attention he had never sought. But tonight, for the first time in years, he would go home knowing that his worth had been recognized, his service had been honored, and his simple commitment to doing the right thing had made a real difference. Judge Blackwood watched him go, pushing his cart down the marble corridor with the same steady precision he had shown every night for 3 years. But now she saw him clearly not as part of the courthouse furniture, but as a guardian who had been protecting them all along. The next morning, newspapers across the country would carry headlines about the defense, Contractor arrested for espionage and the elderly janitor whose vigilance had exposed the plot. Television news programs would feature interviews with Admiral Nick Pemberton praising Marcus's military service, and FBI officials describing how his attention to safety protocols had prevented a major security breach. But perhaps the most significant change would be the quiet revolution in courthouse culture that followed. Inspired by Judge Blackwood's example, judges and attorneys throughout the federal system began acknowledging the service staff who kept their buildings running. Safety protocols were strengthened, employee recognition programs were established, and the assumption that job titles determined human worth began to crumble. Marcus Thompson had spent his career protecting others in naval vessels under enemy fire, in courthouse corridors during routine maintenance, and in a dozen ways that no one had bothered to notice. In the end, his greatest victory wasn't preventing a fire or exposing a spy ring, but proving that true honor isn't defined by rank or recognition, but by the courage to do what's right, even when no one is watching. The old saying proved true once again. There are no small jobs, only small people. And Marcus Thompson, despite what Richard Hawthorne had believed, was anything but small. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.